Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Starr Forum on the Arab Spring and its impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're thrilled to have with us two CIS affiliates, Anat Beletsky and Leila Farsak. We will hear from our guest speakers and then open the floor to Q&A, and I just want to remind you to please remember to use the mics. Professor Beletsky is the Albert Schweitzer Professor of Philosophy at Quinnipiac University, and since 1979 has been a professor at Tel Aviv University. She's been active in the peace movement and in several human rights projects in Israel. She's on the board of Faculty for Israeli-Palestinian Peace and was chairperson of the board of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. Professor Farsak is Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is the author of Palestinian Labor Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and Occupation, and editor of Commemorating the Nakba, Evoking the Nakba, as well as several articles on the political economy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on the one-state solution. Before we get started, I'd like to announce a couple of events that you may be interested in. On April 17th, Jim Walsh will be speaking at an event entitled My 5 Dinners with Ahmadinejad, Iran, Nuclear Weapons, and the Middle East. And on May 7th, James Galbraith will be here for a book talk on inequality and instability. He will discuss the state of the world economy leading up to the Great Crisis. More events and their details are available outside in the foyer. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Beletsky and Professor Farsak.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I'm impressed that you're here, given it's such a nice weather outside. Anat and I agreed that we divided that I'll go first and she'll go second. And what I will try to do, we're going to make it more of a conversation. I will address basically the implication and the impact of the Arab Spring on the Arab attitude towards the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian. What was the impact of that on the Palestinian? But I think in any attempt to assess what has been the impact of the Arab Spring on the conflict, we need to start off by saying what has been the Arab Spring. And it is true the Arab Spring is far from being over. It became summer and winter, and it seems now, too many argue it might have been hijacked and ending in ways that those who started it do not want it. Many people already in the area talk about the counter-revolution that is trying to smash the Arab Spring rather than keep its message alive. But I think over the past 15 months, we can, if we were to do a quick assessment of what this Arab Spring has been about, I would say it has been about 3 very important things. The first thing has been the Arab Spring revealed the importance and the rise of a new generation of Arab activists, of people going out to the street and reclaiming their rights. It broke what people argue, the barrier of fear. People went out to the street demanding democracy, demanding their freedom, asking for justice, for equality. And it's been not just, it started by the youth, but it has galvanized the whole population, and it included important political parties on the left as well as the Islamists. But what's very important, all these people who went out to the street, people who initiated the demonstration in Tunis, in Egypt, also in Bahrain, in Yemen, it's reflective of a new generation coming up and reclaiming the state. What is very important about the Arab Spring, that it's an uprising against the regime, asking to topple authoritarian regime, autocratic regime, dictatorship. But it's a revolution in which the people are not seeking grand revolution. They're not seeking, it's not about ideological struggle. It's not about an Islamic state. It's above all about people demanding from the state to uphold the rights that it promised them. So it's a very important thing. It's, in other words, there is, of course, some rise of nationalism, but it's not a revolution or an uprising the way it was in the 1940s or 50s, in the sense of reclaiming a nationalism, fighting colonialism, wanting, opting for a socialist versus an Islamic versus a liberal agenda. It's really about a revolution of rights, an uprising about reclaiming rights and holding the state accountable to protecting the the rights of the citizens. So, and I think that's very important. And I want to hold on to this. This is the promise of the Arab Spring. This is what the Arab Spring is about. And of course, we've seen the counter-revolution, or how this measure is being hijacked. And we've seen how it did not. I mean, the only success we really have is Tunisia, where the demonstration has led successfully to elections. And in these elections, we've seen the Islamists come to power, Islamic parties, but the Islamic parties who want to play the democratic games, and they've established a constitutional assembly, and then in the process of preparing a constitution that will be voted by the whole population. So in other words, this is the success story of whole Arab Spring, successful transition to democracy, to popular unrest. Egypt can go either way. We've seen how the regime is fighting back strongly. In Libya, for many people, it has been a big fiasco. It brought in foreign intervention, and many people in the region are talking about a new form of colonialism or foreign domination. In Bahrain, it has been smashed. In Yemen, it has been hijacked and reinterpreted. But in all these cases, the success as well as the failure, or those areas where we still don't know where it's going, what is clear and what has been asserted, I think, is that from now on, there is a new generation reclaiming their rights. And for the first time, the regimes in all the Middle East know today that they cannot avoid dealing with popular unrest. They will try to hijack it, they will try to contain it, they will try to manage it, but they can no longer smash it. The people are no longer scared. And I think this is a very important point and an important step, and I want you to hold on to it. The second thing that the Arab Spring has been about, or we've seen the result of the Arab Spring, has been what I call the normalization of Islamic parties in the Middle East, finally. It's the legitimation, finally, of political Islam in the eyes of the West, but also politically, we've seen Islamic parties are those who gained the most in every election that happened. Also in places where the election did not take place, they are the one calling the show or wanting to play a central role. And I think it's very important, it's very healthy, despite all the demonization that has happened in the West about Islamic parties. These parties have shown that they are politically savvy. They're the ones that were able to make the revolution or the uprising succeed because they have a long tradition of organization. And they've also shown willingness and capability to play the democratic game. In other words, then they don't want to just to get to power and remain in power forever, like in Iran, for example. People use it, although Iran is not like this, but Iran is definitely an authoritarian regime. But whether in Egypt or in Tunisia, and also to some extent also in Bahrain, despite what the media represented, these parties Islamic parties are proving to be a version like the Christian Democrats in Europe in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Parties that are religiously affiliated, but that are not demonized the way that the West wants to demonize them. They just reflect the mood of the population. They are conservative, but they are very pragmatic. And I think that's something very important to take in mind. And the third major impact or change that came about with the Arab Spring is that the Arab Spring is revealing that the Middle East, there is a major regional shift in the Middle East, which is very interesting. And we have a split today in the Middle East, in the Arab countries. We have a split between two camps. And this time the two camps are not anti-American and pro-Americans like in the 50s or 60s, or pro-peace process or anti-peace process. They're really about who is for the revolution and who is for the uprising and who is not. And the irony of it is that the conservative regimes, places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are holding the mantle of being the savior of the revolution, which in a sense is very ironic, but also reflects how in any moment of political upheaval, you'll have the ancien regime, the old regime, trying to manipulate the changes to its best advantages. But we're seeing that we have two camps. We have the camps of those who are supporting the uprising and those who want to crash the uprising. We see it in Syria, we've seen it in Yemen. And interesting stuff we've seen new regional actors coming up and other regional actors going on the sides, particularly Syria, I would say. So what have these three changes, or these important developments, to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict, or how do they impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And I think to understand how they impact the conflict, we need to think on about three things as well. We need to think, how far does the Arab Spring impact the basis of the conflict. Does the Arab Spring change anything to the essence of the conflict? Is this conflict still about land? Is this conflict about two national groups? Or is this conflict now about rights? Okay, that's an important question and more difficult question. I might not address it very much, but secondly, and I think this is what you're interested in, is the Arab Spring going to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict? Are we going to have now the peace process? Are we going to sign off to the roadmap? Are we going to implement the two-state solution? I mean, how far does the Arab Spring facilitate the implementation of a two-state solution, which is the international consensus for solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, is the Palestinian stand, official stand for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also is, I would say, the Israeli consensus for solving the problem. And it's paradox. Many people would say, why it's not resolved if everybody agreed that the solution is a two-state solution. But as you know, the devil is in the details, and how you interpret the two-state solution matters a lot. And the question is how far the Arab Spring is going to help implementation of a real two-state solution or not. And I think the third way, and the answer actually lies in how it impacts the actors to this conflict. And this includes not just the Israeli and the Palestinians, but also how it impacts the regional actors, namely Egypt, Syria, Israel, and the United States more generally. I'm not going to address in the rest of my talk how it impacts Israel and the United States. Anat is going to do that. I'm going to address how the Arab Spring impacts the regional actors, the Arab regional actors, which can help or not the resolution of the conflict, and how it impacts the Palestinian. Insofar as impacting the regional actors, which are important to this conflict, what we've seen is, the Arab Spring does not jeopardize in any way the two-state solution. And it does not because, from a regional point of view, the Arab position, the Arab League position, has always been in favor of the two-state solution, okay? And it reiterated it ever since the Beirut Declaration in 2002. If we look at the individual countries, Syria has been the country which has been most reluctant towards the Arab-Israeli conflict, who has been considered a spoiler in this conflict, who was not really helping the advancement of peace. And seeing the situation now in Syria, has its own issues, the uprising to deal with and to crush, unfortunately, or maybe not. But in any case, it has been weakened regionally as a weight. And we've seen it best with how Hamas decided in the end to close its offices in Syria, to side on the side of the protester against the regime, and to move its offices to Egypt and to Jordan. So an important obstacle, if you wanted to consider it an obstacle, Syria is not very important today to the conflict. And the other thing is what happened with Egypt. Egypt is very important in this regard, and many people were worried about how far is Egypt going to still be an important broker in this conflict, especially given how Mubarak was a very important ally of Israel up until he was ousted. But if we look at what has happened since the fall of Mubarak, the Central Command of the Armed Forces, which is in charge of the country, has clearly said it will uphold all the treaties it has, which means that it's going to uphold its treaty with Israel. Even the Islamic Party has insinuated if they come to power, they are not going to abrogate any treaties. What we've seen, though, is that the Egyptian position has been one of taking a bit of a stand, a bit of a distance from the very pro-Israeli position that people interpreted in Mubarak's time. So Egypt, for example, opened the Rafah checkpoint, which Mubarak had kept closed, is not building the wall that Mubarak wanted to build, has brokered the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. So it has taken distance from Israel and kept and tried to work on the Palestinian side much more, and tried to take a more pro-Arab position, what would argue, which is in line with the mood of the population. Because if you look at what has happened with the Egyptian street are quite upset about Israel and have been quite vocal in expressing this sentiment. We've seen it most clearly with the demonstration that took place in August after Israel killed 5 Egyptian soldiers on the border on Sinai, and the demonstration led to, taking over the Israeli embassy, bringing down the Israeli flag. Then again, another demonstration happened in September that actually led to taking over the embassy and taking out documents out of it. The ambassador leaving, and they were planning also to go to the ambassador's house. So what is Israeli ambassador's house? So this reveals to us is the Arab Spring emboldened the popular Arab feeling of anger against Israel and being more pro-Palestinian. Many people thought that the Arab Spring was not about Palestine, but we've seen that very clearly that it is still about, people are still concerned with the Palestinian question. But at the regime level, and also demonstrator, nobody in the demonstrator said we are against the two-state solution. Everybody is saying, and is for a two-state solution, for a real Palestinian state. It's just people have been more vocal about their anger at Israel's immunity from persecution and its violation. And the regime, at the same time, has kept some distance, but have promised to uphold its treaties. But what has happened, meanwhile, is that we've seen another actor emerging as important, and that's Jordan. All of a sudden, the broker of Israeli-Palestinian peace is no longer Egypt. Israel said that we need to bring in the Jordanian. The Jordanians were very happy to play this role. The vacuum that Egypt created by being so much concerned with its own internal issues has allowed Jordan to play a role. And we've seen that Jordan is the one that brokered the secret negotiation going on between Israel and the Palestinians since January. But Jordan cannot replace Egypt, and Jordan is also coordinating with Egypt. So all what this tells us is that we have another actor, but this other actor, like Egypt, is still for the two-state solution and is still an important broker that can get more concession from the Palestinians and can push them in a certain direction. So on the regional level, all the forces are still supportive of a two-state solution. And actually, the Arab Spring is more conducive to it than before, because Egypt is seen to act a more balanced role, and because Jordan is important supporter of the two-state solution, and because Syria, the spoiler between two commas, is out of the picture. Now, on the Palestinian side, what's happened within the Palestinian? How has the Arab Spring impacted the Palestinian and their attitude towards the solution with Israel? And here I think we have to distinguish between two parties. I think you need to distinguish between what the Palestinians in the streets are saying and thinking, and what the leadership is making out of it. And I think looking at what happened in the West Bank and Gaza is very fascinating, because it provides you a microcosm of what has happened in other Arab countries. The same dynamic that happened in other countries, you see it also among the Palestinians, which is basically the struggle between the people in the streets and the new generation on the one hand, against the leadership, over three things: defining what these protests are about, because Palestinians went to the streets. They went to the streets in March, they went to the street again in May. They are on the streets now, but we don't hear much about it. They do not in the same numbers as in Egypt, maybe, but there is protest going on in the Palestinian street. And there is this competition or this struggle between the leadership on the one hand, or the elite, if you want, the Palestinian elite, and in that I include Fatah as much as Hamas, versus the Palestinian street over defining three things: defining what is the aim of the protest, why people are protesting. Secondly, a struggle over what are the Palestinian national priorities, and how far the two-state solution and the creation of a Palestinian state is really the objective of the Palestinians. And thirdly, over what is the strategy to use vis-a-vis Israel. So with regards to the content of the protest, the people on the streets have been very important. The first demand that they had when they went out to the street in February, but most clearly on March 15, their first demand was the end of the division between Hamas and Fatah. But everybody and all the media focused just on this, that they demanded the end of the division. But if you look carefully at what the demonstrators were also demanding, they were demanding the end of the corruption of the PA. They were demanding elections that have been delayed. They were demanding the reconciliation precisely in order to have elections of the Palestinian Palestinian Legislative Council. And very importantly, and it has not been given enough attention, they've been above all calling for new election for the Palestinian National Council. Now, the Palestinian National Council is very different from the Palestinian Legislative Council, because Palestinian Legislative Council is just election of Palestinian parliamentarian in the West Bank and Gaza. But what these demonstrators have been calling for is actually the election of the Palestinian National Council, which is a part of the PLO, and basically includes this body which represents all the Palestinians, those inside the West Bank and Gaza, but also those in the diaspora, those in the refugee camps, and those inside 48. So they are demanding democracy at every level. They're saying the PA needs to be democratic, and it's not democratic. It has outstayed its mandate. It needs to have elections. But also the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza does not have the last word on what the Palestinians want. There's an important section of the Palestinian population who have been excluded from the democratic process and from the political process for the past 20 years, and these need to be brought back in. So we need to have elections for a new council that represents all the Palestinians in order to decide what is our next step. So that's something very important. And in defining, so in other words, they are asking for a revisiting, or let's sit down and discuss, all Palestinians, are we still for a two-state solution? And the third thing that they have been claiming, which is very important, is they have been in questioning. They have not opposed the Palestinian state, the project of a Palestinian state that still adhere to it, but they shifted emphasis. They said the important thing today is not a Palestinian state or not. Because we've seen that after 20 years of Oslo, we have not got a state. We will not get a state because Israel will not give us a viable state. And actually what we should be fighting on now is our Palestinian rights. And these rights include not just right to independence, right to end of occupation, but also rights for right of return, right to freedom of movement, right to education, a right to housing, right to people in Jerusalem. All these rights have to be re-emphasized. And in these things, you're saying they are, some argue, jeopardizing the two-state solution. But above all, they're saying after 20 years of peace process and after all what happened with the Second Intifada, what they're asking in terms of strategy, the third element I was talking about, is to stop talking with Israel. So they actually were vehemently opposed to the reinitiation of negotiation with Israel because they said this is futile, you're wasting your time. They demonstrated against the resumption of negotiations in Jordan. And they're saying the way to go forward is to rely on nonviolence resistance, something very important, but disengaging with the Israeli. So they've been very violent, very active about being against normalization, against reaching out to Israel, because they're saying the only way how Israel will give concessions is by being forced to give concession. And by going to talking with it, you're just perpetuating the occupation. It makes no sense because Israel continues to build settlements. And we've seen today we have 350,000 settlers in the West Bank and another 150,000.
500,000.
500,000. In total, we have 500,000 with Jerusalem. So how did the leadership react to these things? How did it react to the people in the street demanding election, demanding transparency, demanding reconciliation, in questioning, calling for a rediscussion of what are the Palestinian national priority, and re-questioning the strategy of talking to Israel? And the leadership, of course, the elite has been very astute. So what we've seen, indeed, reconciliation did have happened, or at least an agreement to reconcile. Hamas and Fatah met. The first reconciliation agreement was signed in May, the second one in September, the third one in December. And it's interesting because what really happened with this reconciliation is they agreed not to fight, and they basically agreed that Hamas and Fatah, each one is going to keep its own turf. So Hamas keeps control of Gaza, Fatah keeps control of the West Bank, and although they created lots of very elaborate committees about how to actually institutionalize reconciliation and have new election, they agreed there should be new elections by the end of the year, a new government. It had not materialized. But what this tells us is what has happened, again, as in the rest of the Arab Spring, what has happened is finally the normalization or the legitimation of Hamas in the Palestinian political system. Okay? Not among the population. The population already accepted Hamas. Okay. The problem is that Fatah did not want to accept Hamas. And finally now what has happened is now Fatah agreed that Hamas is an important party to deal with, and the disagreement now is about what shall we share. But finally, it's not negating its existence or negating that it needs to deal with it. It's actually accepting it has to deal with it. Now each one is trying to, like in Egypt, between the Islamists and the leftists and the regime, trying to see who will get a bigger share of the cake, basically. So it's important that you normalize Hamas, and Hamas has actually made some very interesting consideration because Hamas, just like Fatah, is committed to the two-state solution. Okay, it differs on tactics, and is accepting, wants to have new election, and actually has expressed that it is willing to suspend armed resistance and go for nonviolent resistance, which is something also the PA has wanted, which is a very important thing. Now, with regards to the national project, Here it's very interesting what the PA did, or the Palestinian leadership, which is the famous Abbas going to the UN and affirming the Palestinian right to a Palestinian state. Now, there was lots of fanfare about how dare Abbas go to the UN and ask for a UN membership of the Palestinian state. I think he did it in order to keep the Palestinian issue alive, but let's not forget that the Palestinian state, which has been declared in 1988, is already recognized by 120 states. It is not recognized by the European or Israel or the United States. But that act, I think, was very important of Abbas going to the UN and making this, I think, one of the best speeches that he ever did. And it's a speech that rehabilitated him among the Palestinians, among others. It was a very important speech because he reiterated and reminded everybody, the Palestinian included, that the project of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza is a Palestinian national consensus. It was voted on by the Palestinian National Council in 1988. It is something that the Americans have signed on with the roadmap in 2002. In 2002, the roadmap said clearly that the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the establishment of a Palestinian state. Okay? Israel also said that Netanyahu said last year, yeah, we're willing to have a Palestinian state, empty of any content, but the notion of a state is there. And basically, Abbas said, we have a right to a state, it's accepted by everybody, but this time, we're going to get the state through international recognition, and we're inviting international intervention, because after 20 years of trying to negotiate with the Israeli to establish the state, what we've seen is that Israel expanded the settlement and is not interested in giving the Palestinian a state. So we're now transmitting the file to the international community. In other words, we internationalize the conflict again as it was from the origin, which I think was a tactic by him to try and get the Palestinian their independence. And Hamas on that was on board. It did not lead us anywhere because the two central parties to it, which is Israel and the US, are not really for it or do not want it for the time being. And judging from the latest secret negotiations, which are the negotiations in Amman, there are talks about the talks, they're actually quite alarming because Israel for the first time said clearly that in any future agreement between Israel and the Palestinians on defining the borders of the Palestinian state, Israel explicitly said it would annex the major settlement blocks, which is the first time it said it. Usually it has always said Jerusalem, it will annex Jerusalem, and it wants a demilitarized Jordan Valley. But the issue was always, from an international point of view, the settlements were illegal. The Americans have always said the settlements are an obstacle to peace. Now Israel said in any future deal, Israel will be annexing the settlements, which de facto means you're going to have a fragmented Palestinian state. You're not going to have a Palestinian state with territorial contiguity or borders, so no states. So the last element which I need to address is, so if the Palestinian project now, in a way, or the two-state solution from a Palestinian point of view, is the only game in town, the leadership is aware that the street is in questioning how far it is valid. The elite believe that this is a time where we are, the Palestinian Spring so far has led us to a situation in which we are still in the status quo. There is not much we can move beyond it. That's the dark side, if you want. I think the positive side is the fact that you have a new generation saying that we need to redefine our project differently. And they have something very strong to support them, basically the fact that the past 20 years we have tried to implement a two-state solution, and Israel de facto is the one that hijacked it. Now, does this mean we are going to go to a one-state solution? From my discussion with the people over there and seeing what's happening on the ground, what the Palestinians are doing right now, they're saying this is not the time to discuss a two-state or one-state. But what is clear is that now we have to reassert that our struggle is for rights. And so in other words, the state does not matter. We go back to the Arab Spring promise. What we need is that a state upholds the right to the citizens, all the rights, freedom, equality before the law, emancipation. And I think that in the end will have its day. The question is how long will it take until that is being asserted. But I remain optimistic, even if it is hard. Okay.
I really don't want to talk because I just want to talk with Lila. I just want to begin the discussion immediately. especially about this point of being optimistic. I always find it amazing how Palestinians can be optimistic. Another point that I want to say before I begin is that it's absolutely astounding to me how coming from Palestine you see something very different than you would see coming from Israel, and how the whole perspective of an Israel-American lens is so dissimilar to the perspective from an Arab, Middle Eastern, Palestinian lens. So let me start with the following. I'm going to read some words from Obama saying the following. I want to be very clear. This is an Obama speech. I want to be very clear. The people of Palestine have rights that are universal. That includes the ability to determine their own destiny. These are human rights, and the United States will stand up for them everywhere. What's needed right now are concrete steps that advance the rights of the Palestinian people, a path of political change that leads to a future of greater freedom and greater opportunity and justice for the Palestinian people. I spoke directly to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He recognizes that the status quo is not sustainable and that a change must take place. To the people of Palestine, particularly the young people of Palestine, I want to be clear. We hear your voices. I have an unyielding belief that you will determine your own destiny and seize the promise of a better future for your children and your grandchildren. Bring all voices to the table. I'm sure there will be difficult days ahead and many questions remain unanswered. But I'm confident that the people of Palestine can find the answers and do so peacefully, constructively. Most people have discovered that they are worth something, and this cannot be taken away from them anymore, ever. This is the power of human dignity, and it can never be denied. Well, these are Obama's words, except I put in Palestinian everywhere where Obama had said Egyptian. And I changed Mubarak to Netanyahu.
I see.
These were Obama's words last February, to the people of Egypt during the Egyptian Revolution. He had earlier said something very similar to the Arabs, to all the Arabs, in that speech, some people thought, inspiring speech that he gave in June of 2009, at the beginning of his term. And when we heard him then, in 2009, when we heard him in February last year, we thought, why can't he be speaking of the Palestinians? What could possibly be different? Now, I'll get to Obama in the United States a little later because I think the interdependent function of Israel and America is very problematic. I don't know if I want to say that America is a function of Israel, as Stephen Walt would say, or if it's the other way around. But let's go to Israel first, and then I'll sort of meander around and get back to Israel. Next June, this June, there's going to be the 4th annual President's Conference for President Peres in Israel. He's had 3 big conferences. He's having the 4th one. If you saw the list of people invited to these conferences, you would really be floored. I mean, every grand name in international politics, in diplomacy, intellectuals, authors, whether they be leftists, rightists, liberals, conservatives, politicians, some human rightists, everybody's there. It's an amazing list. It's called the Israeli Presidential Conference, and the theme this year is Facing Tomorrow. Of course, they call it inspired by the vision of Peres, and I won't say anything about his vision. When you look at the list of topics that will be addressed there, and this is what's striking for me, the first topic is called the Arab Spring and its aftermath. So it's clear that the Arab Spring is right up there in the headlines. But if you go down the whole list of topics, there is nary a mention of the word Palestine or Palestinians. The three topics that get a little close to something that would interest us when we talk about the impact of the Arab Spring and its aftermath on Palestine or Israel-Palestine are the following. They have the state of Israel versus its delegitimization agents. They have Israel's concept of national security in light of the changing trends in the Middle East and the world. And they have the tomorrow of Jewish-Arab coexistence in Israel. In other words, Israel is concerned with the impact of the Arab Spring on its reputation, on its security, and on internal Israeli relations.
Yeah.
But there's a disconnect between Israel's perception of the Arab Spring and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what we ask ourselves, we being Israelis who are worried about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we ask ourselves is how is it that the Palestinian population, which has been oppressed for so long, whose human rights have been violated for so long, why has it been ignored in the conversation about the Arab Spring within Israel or, as we'll see in a moment, in the United States? It's not that we don't talk about the Arab Spring, but we don't make that connection. And what I want to do is think of three factors that go into answering this question. I'll get to the United States and Israel. They will be number 2 or 3. But the first thing I want to say, and I'm not stepping on your territory here of Palestine, but I want to ask a conceptual political question about the Arab Spring vis-a-vis the Palestinian Revolution, or whatever it is, whatever kind of resistance it is that Lila was talking about, because that is so important conceptually. Lila, I'm thinking even of a word that you said, of a sentence that you said right at the end, the state, the demand for rights from the state. And the first thing I ask when I ask about the Palestinian demand, of which state? Who is it that is oppressing the Palestinians? How can we see the Palestinian Revolution, if there be one, as in any way similar to the other revolutions and the other resistances coming out of the Arab Spring? Granted, there's diversity there, granted that they are all very different. And Lila's gone through all of those. But the one thing, I think the label that we can stick onto all the other Arab revolutions is that these are people coming up against their own leadership. And I think it's a very clear structure that goes through, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and for different reasons and because of different internal structures. But basically, we can always say that they are overthrowing or trying to overthrow a leader. Now, in the Palestinian case, who is it that the Palestinians could, would, or should be trying to overthrow? Pardon me? Oh, yeah, okay. I'll get to that, and I know you can take a shortcut and say Netanyahu. But I think from what we heard from Leila, it's so much more nuanced and so much more complex for the Palestinians. So where Leila said that it was very similar, that there's a similar dynamic, I think that what I would try to say is that there might be a similar dynamic internally in Palestine. But since, as you just said, not just Netanyahu, since the occupation is an Israeli occupation, since the occupation will be celebrating its 45th anniversary this June, we can't just look at it as an internal dynamic, even between Palestinian people and their own leaders. And this complication of an external occupation and external oppression makes it so much harder to assess, definitely to fight the fight. And I'll get to that at the end. We know that when the Palestinians started demonstrating in support of Egypt at the beginning of the Egyptian Revolution, it was the Palestinian leaders who put those demonstrations down. it was very happily announced by both Israel and the United States that the Palestinian leaders are the ones who are oppressing their own people. But every time we think of what Palestinian leaders do, of their rules and regulations, we should always be apprised of how much their rules and regulations are really their rules and regulations, and how much of it is really Israeli rules and regulations. How much, excuse me for the word, how much, I don't want to say cooperation, I want to say collaboration, is there between Palestinian leaders and Israeli authorities? And if you look at it that way, the question is, who would the revolution be against? Who are you revolting against? Who are you trying to resist? I think that talking about the impact of the Arab Spring on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to take this into account. And that's why we can't draw a straight line, just an arrow that says, here's an Arab Spring, and here are revolutions coming up. One of them is the Palestinian Revolution. No, it doesn't work that way, because the basic infrastructure of Palestine, its people, and its leaders is not in any way similar to the other Arab revolutions because of this, I was going to say, small aspect, the Israeli occupation, which has to be brought in as the main question that must be asked. All right, so that's all I can say about Palestine. Now I'll get to it at the end, but I think that's what we really have to talk about. All right, the United States. There was an article, an interview, with Robert Malley last August. So it's not that up to date, but it was already after the Arab Spring was well in tow. And Robert Malley was asked, how would Israel react to a Palestinian revolution, revolt, real resistance? How would America react to Israel's reaction? How would the world react to Israel's reaction to such a resistance? And Malley says the following. I found this, again, astonishing. He says, well, there are three ways of resistance. One is violent resistance, one is diplomacy and negotiation, and one is nonviolent resistance. He said that the Palestinians have realized, or think now, that the first two options don't get us anywhere. You said that about diplomacy and negotiations. We've realized, or Palestinians have realized, that's not going to get them anywhere. We've realized, oh, notice this. Who's the we that I'm talking about? Okay. The Palestinians have realized that violent opposition is not going to work. And Malley suggests to them, and this is reminiscent of the inane question, where is the Palestinian Gandhi, or worse, where is the Palestinian Shalom Achshav, where's the Palestinian peace now? He's suggesting to the Palestinians that they should now go the way of nonviolence, which, Leila, you mentioned too, that they are realizing this. I think there's a very big difference between suggesting this to them and having, or reporting on the realization. More than that, there are two problems with this suggestion. One is just the factual presupposition that thinks that the Palestinians haven't engaged in nonviolent opposition for years and years and years and years. The fact that it's not covered, the fact that the media doesn't know about it, the fact that we go to Bilin and Nalin and the whole rest of them every single week and nobody knows about that, that's an interesting question, again, about Israeli, American, worldwide media. I don't have statistics, how many people blow themselves up as opposed to how many people go to nonviolent demonstrations, but it's clear that the strategy of nonviolence has been around for a long, long time. So I find it curious that Bob Malley would mention this as a new thing. Secondly, and there's reason to ask, why is it that people don't know about it? But secondly, my original quotes from Obama, my original question, what would America or the world do? How would they react to real Palestinian resistance coming up now. Obama did say, I have it somewhere here, yes, in Cairo in 2009, Obama did say, "Let there be no doubt the situation for the Palestinian people is intolerable." This is what he said about Palestine.
The Cairo speech.
Okay, yes, the Cairo speech. "America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own." Now, if you think of American reaction or response being a more thoughtful reaction, to the Arab Spring, we saw America twisting and turning. Definitely twisting and turning. When you look at the speeches that Obama himself made while the Egyptian revolution was going on, you could see him trying to navigate. And it's fascinating for anybody who studies rhetoric, anybody who studies the logic of speech-making. But those twists and turns, for some reason, and I have no answer, I only have a question here, for some reason, those twists and turns, when applied in the Palestinian case, become only twists. I see no place where America is now upholding any, or trying to even uphold any of these statements that Obama made, witness his speeches to AIPAC or anything that's been going on recently. So in the case of the United States, I would say that I am not only not optimistic, but very despairing. And that brings me, of course, to Israel and what is happening inside Israel. What can we point to in Israel? First of all, within Israel, the aftermath of the Arab Spring is a shutting in and a shutting down. And I want to elaborate on this a bit, and then I'll finish. It's clear that the hostility to Israel in Arab states has grown through the Arab Spring. And Israelis are getting reports of this at all times. There have been a lot of meetings in Europe mostly, not in America so much, of Israelis, Palestinians, some Egyptians, some Americans, everybody talking about what's happening with the Arab Spring, and what's coming back to Israel from all the people who are going to these meetings is the very clear and explicit hostility towards Israel. Now, why would this hostility be strengthened by the Arab Spring? And not what is the reason for the hostility. The reason for the hostility is usually very clear. The occupation and the siege. Those are the two words that we hear all the time, occupation and siege. But so those are the reasons for hostility. But what would the Arab Spring have to do with strengthening that hostility? And Lila mentioned these a little differently. One is the thought that the old regimes, the ones who have been overturned or the ones that are being fought against, were in cahoots with Israel. Definitely Mubarak. That's the icon. And in that sense, you come out against Mubarak, you come out against his treaty with Israel. Jordan is very interesting how they're trying to play this. I mean, they have a peace treaty with Israel too. So that's one reason. Another reason, which Lila also mentioned, was the fact of popular opinion, public opinion, where the Arab states are now very attuned to what the man in the street, the woman in the street are saying, not only about Israel, but definitely about Israel. So you have these two things going in, both the leaders being in cahoots and the public being vocal. An Israeli journalist called Barak Ravid has called the situation in Israel now, given this understanding of the hostility, he has called it the winter hibernation, that Israel has gone into winter hibernation. And what Israel has done, and these are the Israeli authorities, granted, Israeli leaders, what they have done is enclose Israel in a very consistent call it defense. One is physical. They've built that amazing wall between Israel and Egypt now. You just can't imagine the speed and the efficiency and the sophistication that went into putting up that wall in 2 seconds flat on the Egyptian border and on the Jordanian border. Okay, so we now have more walls than ever before. I remember speaking here 3 years ago or something about the original wall, and it's just amazing to see these walls. This has come up directly as a result of the Arab Spring. A second thing is a great addition to security budgets. Much more money is going in now for the military and for all other security aspects. And the third thing is Israel's lack of any desire or step, any gesture towards the Palestinians. This week there was something, yes, something there, and there's always these supposed talks about supposed talks about supposed talks. But basically what we're seeing is a lack of any Israeli incentive towards the Palestinians. And this is what, as I said, Ravid has called the winter hibernation. What about the Israeli populace? And this is what I find that we have to think about. Just like in Palestine, you might have said, well, maybe the people are different from the leaders who are closing up like this. Well, last August, we had the tent revolution in Israel. 2 months before Occupy Wall Street. Same mantras, same cliches, same slogans. I'm not putting them down. As you found here in Occupy Wall Street, as we heard before in Madrid and in London. And I always think of those as having something to do with the revolutions in the Arab Spring. That's a different issue, but it is clear that the world, this new generation, which was not only an Arab generation, a new generation all over the world, was calling out for social justice. And indeed, Israeli kids, they were between 25 and 40 mostly. Israeli kids went out to Rothschild Boulevard, put up almost 2 kilometers of tents. This has been the greatest, most vociferous and most voluminous protest ever encountered in Israel. It went on for almost 2 months, middle of July till middle of September, with all sorts of hangers-on later. There were 2 demonstrations. One had 300,000 people in it. Another had 500,000 people in it. You walk in those demonstrations and you really think the whole country is up in resistance. And they were calling for social justice. One could say that it's the same kind of call, the same kind of let us have equal health benefits, housing. And the slogan was, the people demand social justice. The question is, where does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict fit in there? And it doesn't. I think that contrary to the Israeli leaders who are clear about their panic from the Arab Spring, the young generation here were not in any panic about the Arab Spring. They were just continuing with regular Israeli proclivities that have nothing to do with that conflict. And in fact, the leaders of the tent revolution, whom some of us embraced immediately, we thought, okay, here is the new generation that's going to change things. They insisted that they were not political. And what they meant by not political, when they asked about it, they don't want to hear anything about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. There were some attempts to show that if you want more money for housing, maybe you should put less money in the settlements or something like that. You know, people who were doing small accounting jobs. But that didn't mean anything to anybody. The point was, we are not political. We care only about our internal social, economic injustice, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has nothing to do with this. So in that sense, I would say that the Arab Spring just passed above or behind or just past the Palestinians and the Palestinian issues for anybody in Israel. We've been talking for so long, but I still want to tell you a funny joke. When I thought of what I could say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as being impacted by the Arab Spring, what came to mind is an Israeli spoof from 30 or 40 years ago, a joke that's told in some funny group that was making fun, satiring a radio show or a television show that was called What is New in Science? Nothing is new in science. This has been our show, What is New in Science? And basically, I felt like saying, what has been the impact of the Arab Spring on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? There has been no impact, or if anything, there has been only a negative impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within Israel. Unless, and this is a risky unless for an Israeli to voice, unless we think, we the Israelis, dare to think that the Palestinians can do something. I say it's risky because it is patronizing, because we are not in Palestinian shoes, because we do not understand exactly what goes in and out of anything that happens in Palestine. But Amira Hass, who is the most trustworthy Israeli journalist in Israel, she has lived for almost 2 decades now, first several years in Gaza, and now she is in Ramallah. Amira Hass, I met her 2 weeks ago, and she dares to suggest things to Palestinians. I think she's the only person who can do so with some integrity. She's the only one who would be taken seriously or who has any kind of legitimacy in doing that. And she says that she has suggested to the Palestinians that, yes, they must revolt. Against who? Well, she doesn't explicitly say so, but she hints they should revolt against their own leaders first, so as to make it very clear that they are then revolting against the occupation. And the reason Amira says this is because Israel and Israelis will not revolt. Not because of morality, not because they are or are not afraid and are closing up, but because it is not in Israel's interest to change anything. The status quo is very much in Israel's interest. So according to Amira, and I quote her here, and I accept this only because it's the only way forward, according to Amira, if the Palestinians do not do it, no one will do it. Thank you.
Yeah? Okay, I thought there might be a moderator, or I thought maybe the two of you wanted to talk first.
No, let's take the questions.
Okay, I just have, well, I have a lot of questions, but I'll, in fairness, just put one to each of you. Thank you for your presentations and for your openness and your honesty. And 2 questions of fact for you, Laila. When you mentioned in passing that the Jordanian regime seems to be able or in a position, did you mean, to make or to get more compromises from the Palestinian side than, I guess, the current Egyptian? That's what I wasn't clear about. I thought I heard you say that.
No, what I said is that the Jordanian will not get more concession from the Palestinians. It's not the issue. It's the question who can now act as a regional protector, if you want, of the Palestinian, or a regional broker. And given that Egypt has taken a position whereby the priority now is to end the conflict between Hamas and Fatah, and it clearly sees that Israel is not interested in negotiation. She said this is not something that we should waste our time in. And this is where Jordan had a venue say, okay, I can now play a role. Maybe I can do some informal, but it's nothing. It's not a question of putting more pressure on the Palestinian or the Israeli. It's just a space for it finally to play a role that it did not play before because Egypt was playing it. That's what I mean.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And then, Anat, when you said that and you were quoting the leaders of the tent movement saying, we're not political, we're just concerned about social justice inside Israel, are you also wanting us to presume, or are there real facts also that you could share with us, that in their heart of hearts, the 450,000 or the 500,000 people who demonstrated feel that way? Or, as I had presumed, and I thought maybe some commentators said, but maybe it was just their speculation, there was too high a cost to pay in the long run, and at that point, the leaders of the tent movement were thinking in the long run that if they were immediately saying, our rebellion includes the need for Palestine to no longer accept the occupation, that would change the domestic dynamics of the public support that they were trying to get from Israelis. So they were putting up a wall, but that was done with words that may not have expressed all of what they cared about. Could you clarify that for us, please?
Yeah, thanks. That's a wonderful question, because all I can do is report on impressions, some of the surveys that we did, some of the conversations that we had in the tents, because we spent days and nights with them in the tents. I wouldn't say it was a long-term consideration. It was perhaps at some point a pragmatic consideration. Very short-term, actually, rather than long-term. And the point was, they had all these counselors, advertising and marketing people, telling them what to do and how to get more people on board. And people immediately told them, if you split this up into left and right, then people on the right won't come. If you split this up into secular versus religious, you won't have the religious people with you. So there was that part of the agenda. We're all together in this, yes, and that was a pragmatic move. Do I think that more of them think inside that it is connected? No. We talk to them a lot. Many of them, most of them, and we see this in Israeli polls over and over again, and it's been a downhill poll taking. We see less and less Israelis caring about the Palestinian question. They have their own life to live. They have their own hardships. What came out of this great demonstration was that the Israeli middle class was not doing well at all. Very, very similar to what was coming out here with Occupy Wall Street. Yeah. They have their own problems, and they really don't care. So their leaders perhaps entertained the question of the Palestinians on a pragmatic level. But all the protesters, the 500,000 people who marched, most of them really don't care. I should qualify that with one thing. There were Arab Israeli-Palestinians from Yafo, from in Haifa, of course, from Nazareth, who did come on board. And we did see amazing interaction in parts of the tent cities that came up in these places of very poor people, really from the slums, Jewish slums, for the first time ever getting together with Israeli Palestinians and marching together and trying to work out certain strategies as to what they would say in their banners. I thought that was moving. I thought it was promising. I thought it was wonderful. And that's what all bubbles are like. They're moving, they're wonderful, but they didn't do anything.
But there's something I'd like to follow up on what I hope it was clear in my presentation when you're talking about the conceptual meaning of the Arab Spring. For the Palestinians, and that's what I said when they were discussing what are the national priorities, I hope it was very clear. Everybody is clear that what has to end is the occupation. This has not been in question. They understand, the Palestinians have not been in an introvert process about democracy. The very clear message of saying we want elections, but these elections are not just election of the PA, it has to be the election of the Palestinian National Council, is a debate about the larger national question. In saying there's no point negotiating with Israel, we have to redefine our national priorities and our strategy. This is a question of how do you fight the occupation. This attack against all normalization meetings. In Ramallah, people attacked meeting between Israelis and Palestinians. In Jerusalem, they did not allow people to meet in the Ambassador Hotel. So it's all in the context that the Arab Spring for the Palestinian is a reassertion of the Palestinian fight against occupation. But they're also pushing the envelope further. They're saying it's not just about occupation, it's all about the Palestinian state. They're saying it is about Palestinian national rights more globally. And what they are, these, is not just creating a state. It's about the right of return. It's about equality in front of the law. It's about equality of Palestinians inside 48. So they're actually pushing these issues in the center of the debate in ways that have always been there, but now are taking a more populist mobilization. So I hope you did not get it wrong. And also Hamas, the whole point of Hamas and the normalization of Hamas has always been about affirming Palestinian rights and about fighting with the PA or Fatah over the tactic. Basically, recognizing Israel before you get your concession is a major loss, because it's the only leverage you have. And nothing will make me, Hamas, recognize Israel before it gives me the state, because we already saw it with Fatah. We saw the PLO and it didn't get us anything. So that's something very important that I want everybody to be conscious of. But what is becoming very important is the fact that people are saying we need to change tactic. That this obsession with statehood, this obsession that sovereignty is going to solve our problem, is not true. Okay? So what are these implications in the long term? People are saying now we cannot think very much about the long term. Yeah, we have to have a larger discussion. But in the immediate, we have to unify our position and reassert our rights and re-question the Palestinian state as a model for liberation. But I'd like also to comment on the Israeli side, why the Israelis are not concerned with the Palestinian problem. They can afford not to be concerned with the Palestinian problem. I mean, you build all this wall, no Israeli can see any Palestinian anymore. 20 years ago, at least the Palestinians were workers. You had to interact with them, you had to pay them, you had to fight. They were... You know what? You had Israeli soldiers at the checkpoints. There was a physical connection. Now you go through these checkpoints, you have mirrors, you have windows. The Israeli is being sanitized from the Palestinian. He doesn't see him, he doesn't interact with him. And the occupation, what is so phenomenal about what has happened over the past 20 years, is now the occupation has become a poison in the air. It's not something that you can touch. When the Palestinians went and demonstrated against the Nakba Day, they threw stone on the wall because there was no soldier they could throw a stone at. Okay, but it's very important, because what has happened with that is that it's a very difficult position for the Palestinian, because how can you make your enemy see you when the enemy does not want to see you, let alone or your partner? I mean, if that's your partner is not even seeing you. And on the Israeli side, the media has succeeded, the system has succeeded, the past 20 years have succeeded in allowing the Israeli to live a very good, safe life without seeing any Palestinian, without talking about any Palestinian, So if you don't see him, how can you? And I think this is what needs to break. Will the Arab Spring help breaking it? I think that, yeah, because it brought up this fear again. And guess what? Maybe you think you can forget the Palestinian, but we worry now about people in Egypt, attacking the embassy. But what was the slogan of the people in Egypt? Palestinian rights. They not go and attack Israel because they want to attack Israel. So it's also a question of what the Israelis want to hear and not hear, because the Palestinian question is still very alive in the Arab states.
Yeah, but what you're saying, and in connection with your question again, do the Israelis know? Do the Israelis care? Can they know? Of course they can know. They choose not to know. But again, the media decides what it's going to put in. This whole structure, again, that Lila is describing has been more than 20 years, but the last 20 years have been very, very essential here. A clear separation. And Israelis can live their life. And think of this is the third generation already. Some Israelis have never been anywhere near the West Bank. Yeah. They know there's a wall there. You drive anywhere you drive in Israel, you see the wall. I mean, it's there. But you are enclosed in this fluff, and that's it. And when you say there is a new fear, yes, there is a new fear, but it's only gone towards strengthening Israeli paranoia. They all want to throw us into the sea. It hasn't opened up their eyes to the Palestinian demands as Palestinian demands, or as demands against us. It is part of this Arab outside that is all against us. So there's no real awareness of the Palestinian issue. Go.
Would you like to go ahead? We'll go back and forth. Thank you both for your talk. I had this curiosity as you were speaking, which is what has been the impact on the Arab Spring on peoples outside of the Middle East, particularly on youth and people who might have had maybe a negative perception of Arabs or Egyptians. And and how might that affect the Palestine conflict? So I was thinking that the youth in this country who established Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Boston, in distinction from Anat's description of the Israeli youth in Rothschild Boulevard, was that Israel and Palestine are very much part of their platform, or how do you say that, what they care about. So I think to us here, there is a clear connection. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it's just, we're not just calling for economic...
Yeah,
right?
because it's fundamentally what is very important is that it's a struggle for rights, for equality, for, end of oppression. The 99% is all about, wanting some form of equality, some form of justice. It's the connection with Palestine is always this issue of justice, and justice is a very difficult thing to decipher or to achieve, but I think that's the connection.
So to the extent that it puts it on that radar screen, and I think it is on the radar screen of the young people, and there's Occupy movements in other countries. And then the piece about, all of us seeing the Egyptians in Tahrir Square and people who didn't have any exposure to Arabs or Egyptians, I'm thinking that's had a very positive impact on them, and it might influence how they relate to Israel-Palestine. Not sure, but possibly. And then the piece about the focus on rights. So to what extent those of us outside of the Middle East are making that transition ourselves from the focus of land to the focus on rights, that it's now higher in our consciousness, and at least in the United States, because we are funding the occupation, that it might help raise our consciousness, and if we can end our support of the occupation, that might be another positive result of that.
We waver. A lot of us waver. It's not just optimism and despair. It's a question of how much efficacy there is, how much can you move things or change things. I am now in the headset of the bubble. I think we are all in a bubble. And it's not that I think that Occupy Wall Street will not have its effects, and the effects might be much later on, and we might not be cognizant right now or be able to articulate the exact effects. The question of rights is very important. I teach in a university that is not in Boston, that has students who are typical American students, middle class, no higher, not intellectual contexts. Some of them still do not know what Occupy Wall Street is. Forget Israel-Palestine or the Arab Spring. So that's the side of the despair. The other side, and that's what's so important for me, is the rights. This new emphasis on the language of rights and on mostly human rights, but definitely civil political rights, being somewhere up front now. I was thinking when Lila was speaking about the one-state, two-state solution, two-state discussion being not very important now. You were quoting people saying it's not very important. Yes, but if you emphasize rights, you very quickly get to the one-state solution rather than the two-state solution, and that's what I find with students who are thoughtful. They say to me, well, if it is all a matter of rights, then everybody's human rights have to be respected here. In Israel, that's the one little glimmer of light that I see, with younger people saying that if human rights are the issue, then here are the borders from the river to the sea. Doesn't matter where you draw the borders, and we want a state of all our citizens, or something like that, of all its citizens, or things like that. So that's where I see the rights discussion going, not specifically to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and not specifically from the Arab Spring, but the whole rights discourse that was starting to blossom 20 years ago. Some people, in fact, have written now that it's been overdone. But I think through rights talk, we are getting a different discussion.
You have to say it has been emboldened by the Arab Spring. What is fascinating about the Arab Spring is this discourse of right that has been going on for 20 years now has a grassroots generational demand, which is very well entrenched.
But not only in the Arab Spring. I mean, I don't think Occupy Wall Street came out of the Arab Spring. That's what I'm saying. The rights came for this whole generation.
Yeah, but I have to say something which I need to clarify, that when you say about framing Palestinian struggle in terms of right, we should not forget that it has always been framed in rights. The question that people came to the TwoState Solution not because they just thought it would be nice to have a state. The argument was, and the faith was in the 1980s, is these rights would be best protected in a Palestinian state, because Israel doesn't want a one-state solution, because the international consensus has been on a two-state solution. So the best we could get is to create a Palestinian state after doing a historical compromise, which we did by accepting a state on 22% of historic Palestine. And in this state, we'll have all these rights: the political rights, the freedom rights, the human rights, the economic rights, the sovereignty right, the right of return. All these will be in the state. That what has happened now is that we realize, the Palestinians realize that this state is not going to materialize. And what has happened is basically a police structure of an autonomy, of a Bantustan that has been created. And the challenging question to all those among the Palestinians when you discuss a two-state, one state, the first question comes, okay, if I'm going to have a one-state solution and talk about rights, what will be the state? Because it's giving up your national rights. What do you do with national rights? And that's a very difficult discussion. Like if you hear the debate between or very clean Palestinian, if you want, not political, parvenu or people who want power, that generation who fought for the establishment of a Palestinian state, they accuse the one-stater of being traitors, because basically say, what are you talking about? You're basically talking about becoming like a Palestinian citizen of Israel. You're accepting the success of Zionism. You're accepting the rights, that the right won. It's one state de facto is going to be an Israeli state, because the Israelis are more powerful economically and politically. So it's yet not that easy. Rights, yes, but as you said, going back to that, it still poses larger questions about what should the character of the state be. Okay, sorry, we kept you waiting for too long.
No, that's fine. I have one kind of a comment on the way that you've characterized the Arab Spring as being about rights. And for sure there's a vocal liberal element that it is about rights. But I think in a general sense you might characterize it as a call for good government. And how they see what good government is, some see it in Islamic government. And so the rise of the Islamic parties, I think in the spirit of the Arab Spring, in some ways it reminds me of a little bit right now of Iran, might be that both sides sort of overthrew the Shah because it was just bad government. And then eventually there was a violent struggle for power that led to the clerics in the Islamic Republic. So that was just the first comment in terms of seeing it maybe in that respect. The second thing I have is you posed a question, I think it was in your talk, about what incentive is there for Israel to solve this problem, and that the status quo works in Israel's interest was the statement. I'm going to shape it a different way. I'm a national security fellow over at Harvard. I'm going to look at it from a strategic perspective, not a local issue, and what I would consider from the Army perspective a tactical issue. That the issue of the Israel-Palestine issue may actually have a strategic framework that does work in Israel's interest. And the reason I say this is the trajectory is for a third intifada. If you don't do something, although you're happy, although right now in the short term there's no interest, if you don't make a change, the trajectory is bad and it could turn to a third intifada. So there may be an interest in the long term to make progress. And the second or two reasons would be this issue with Iran. Iran may present a window of opportunity because there is a common interest between the Arab neighbors and Israel. That Israel, in its calculus of what's in the best interest for our security, that this movement on this particular issue, if we were to, let's say, take the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 as a sign to Saudi Arabia, just as a way of moving forward in that relationship that would lead to the Arab recognition of Israel as a state, which I think is what they've wanted all along, that Israel wants to be at least recognized by all of its neighbors as a state, that would give it a window to also work with its Turkish relationship, which is going to be important if you're looking to contain this rising Iranian influence that people fear, that by moving forward on this, it might actually help patch things up with the Turks, it might help with the Arab neighbors. So just from a strategic framework, what might be in their interest, that may be in their interest.
You go first, then
Well, I agree with you, and there are many people in Israel making this argument that you're making, but Israeli leadership does not see it this way. They see that in the long run, they can afford, there are many, you're saying, you're proposing, and you're suggesting a strategic logic that is there, has been proposed actually by Shaul Mufaz now, the one who is seeking to get elected as the next prime minister. He's posing an argument exactly like the one you're presenting. That it's not our interest to have a war with Iran. The only way how we can contain Iran is to have a two-state solution, this, to give the Palestinians their state, and by giving their state, will be fully integrated because everybody wants us. The question is, does really the Israeli military and the Israeli political establishment want that? Netanyahu doesn't seem to want it. Baituna's party doesn't seem to want it because it's an old tradition in Zionist political thinking, okay, which is the only way how we can remain strong is by showing strength and not giving any concession, especially to weaker parties. So what? The Palestinians, we solve the problem by putting them in a big prison in Gaza. And actually, if they have a third intifada, better, because then we can again say, you see, it's violence. Huh? I mean, the difficulty today of Palestinian resistance is that if you turn violent, you call it terrorism when it is legitimate resistance. Okay, and if you don't do any violent resistance, they are not hearing you. And a third intifada, though, would justify to Netanyahu, this is why we need the security, because, we cannot talk with them. But what is worrying Israel is the process of delegitimization. I mean, Israel is far more worried about all this campaign about boycott and divestment against Israel, although right now, in terms of economic impact, is zero. But in terms of self-image, is quite bad. The issue of many people delegitimizing Israel and saying Israel is the faulty one and calling Israeli apartheid, all these. Now, what would get the Israeli establishment to change position? I think American intervention. Americans say, you know what, this is not going to work anymore because it's not in our interest, okay, because everybody made the concessions necessary. But I want to come back to your original point, which I thought I made it clear in my presentation, but I reiterated. Those who want, I don't think the Arab Spring is about an Islamic government. It's about asserting the right of Islamic parties to enter the political system, yes. That's very important. So far, they've been in the opposition. What they want, Islamic parties, is to be in the political system and to win elections. And here, I can see the worry that there is a wide spectrum. Because when we talk about Islamic parties, we don't talk about one single party. We can talk about the Salafis at the far end, but you can talk about the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers, they have for years been demonized. But if you look at every Muslim brother party in the whole Middle East, over the past 30 years, you'll see the tremendous change that happened in their thinking, in their approach. 25 years ago, they talked, we want Sharia to be the law. Now, many parties are not saying we want to do Sharia. We want to be inspired by the Sharia, but nobody's using it. 25 years ago, they used to say the Christians will be dhummi, which means that people that are citizens, but they cannot govern. Now, the Islamic Party, Muslim Brothers in Egypt, clearly said that the Christians of Egypt, the Copts of Egypt, are full citizens like everybody else, and they can even become leaders at one point. So they've shown, above all, in my view, and if you see the experience, especially of Tunisia and also of Egypt, they've shown that they understand the democratic game, they want the democratic game, and they will respect the democratic game. It's not anymore like Iran. Okay? And there are two reasons why it cannot become like Iran, in my view. Because there is no Khomeini, and because, believe it or not, Islamic parties in the Middle East have become no longer idealized. For example, the experience of Hamas in the West Bank, I can tell you that people are as angry at Hamas as they are of the PA. Once you get them to power, people do not anymore believe, and Hamas is aware of it, is aware that it's losing legitimacy, is aware that the only way how it can maintain support, Islamic parties are aware of that, they need to be inclusive, they need to respect the democratic game. So I wouldn't worry about that. What I would worry about is how the regimes are using Islamic politics. Again, like in Egypt, like we saw it now in Egypt. The person of the regime, Omar Suleiman, is being presented as the guy who's going to save Egypt from the Islamic takeover. So,
but Lila, this is not just what I want to start with that rather.
I'm concerned about minority rights with
but yeah,
and the other thing is
if you see Tunisia and you see Egypt, the Muslim Brothers in both cases are not treating them as minorities. They're treating them as full citizens. They're not calling the Christians a minority. They're calling the Christians full Egyptian citizen with full rights. They took away all that discourse of 25, 30 years ago. So I mean, that's what we present in the West, yeah, that we're worried about them because we don't know them, because we saw what happened in Iran.
But the Western perception of this is so wrong. I'm looking at this through the question of women's rights. Conventional wisdom here is that women's rights are out now, and the political Islamism is killing them off. When you talk to the women's movements, and we're in touch with the women's movements in the Middle East, they are very diverse. Some are secular, granted. These are more the older feminists. The new feminists are asking for religion to clean off the corruption. I mean, religion is being treated as something very different than the Iranian type of theocracy. And we're again struck by the women's movements because they are not shying away from the religious parties, not at all, and they are no less feminist for that. That they are insisting on women's rights as human rights, but they are not doing it necessarily from a secular viewpoint. So we are looking at something much more complicated. But I just want to come back to what Israel wants and why Israel will or will not attack Iran and what it'll do. Just one important point there, and Lila is being, I think, a little too generous with the Zionist interests here. Some mantras, like the one, there's going to be a third intifada, or this can't go on forever, or, you know, you can't step on people for too long, they'll rise up against you. Those are mantras. And what Israel has realized is that it can step for a long time. It's definitely trying to get to the point where these Bantustans will be enclosed, very under control, and this is the place where I worry. They will call it a two-state solution. Yeah. They will call it a Palestinian state. That's what I was talking about when I mentioned collaboration of Palestinian authorities, because the Palestinians that I speak to are very worried that the Palestinian authorities will accept this and will sign off and say this is Palestine and this is the two-state solution. And you can't just use that expression, two-state solution. First of all, the word solution is funny. But you can't even say two states without going into the question of what makes a state. Yeah. And if those states will be enclosed behind the walls with complete Israeli, what's it called in the UN, effective Israeli control, what we have in Gaza now. It's effective Israeli control. If the Palestinians sign off on it, then the world will applaud, and you'll have a two-state solution, but it will definitely not be a solution. But Israel is going that way, and Israel will be very happy with that.
So we'll take just the last question.
But thank you so much.
Well, you can ask us afterwards.
Come ask us here.